Kia ora everyone. Welcome to another episode of Render Radio, but this one especially is sort of framed under a series of conversations we want to have called The Uninfluencer, which, to frame up, is all about having conversations with leaders and thinkers and people of great thought and experience of life in a different context, not just from a biblical perspective, but also maybe from a leadership lens, a life lens, and looking at how we might have real conversations. Today, I'm really excited. We have a friend of mine and, pastor, leader, guy who's been through a lot of life change, especially over the last 12 months, made some significant life change within the last sort of 5 years, and how that has sort of led us to this journey where things have maybe taken a bit of a change or a pivot or a turn, not just in lockdowns and COVID, but also through just different seasons of life and having to deal with the unexpected and maybe somewhat the expected. And that is my friend Emile, and I'm going to let him sort of introduce himself in a moment. But we're going to go on that journey and talk about his journey into pastoral leadership. And without giving too much away, some of the changes and those shifts that I just mentioned before that himself and his wife, Danielle, decided and made with their leadership team to make changes on and navigate through into a different season. And then also very optimistically trying to understand what we can about what is happening right now. What is God saying to them? Where is God leading them? And what that future might hold. So with that being said, my bro, I'm really appreciative of your time. I know you're a busy man and you got family and work and life and everything that's going on, but you've given some time here today to talk with us and to talk with me. So maybe if you just introduce yourself, brother, and then sort of what you do now and what you've been up to lately, and then we'll dive straight into some of the questions going back a few years.
Yeah, no, thanks, Cliff. It's so good to be here. I think we've been pretty tight, me and you, for some reason. I remember actually the first time people were like, have you met Cliff? And for about a year, everyone was like, you know Cliff, eh? And I was like, no, I don't know this guy. And I remember actually meeting you. It was in the lobby of a conference that we were at. And you came over to me and like, hey, you're that Emile guy. And I was like, you must be Cliff. And what an amazing path it has gone through from, I think it was 2016 and to where we are now. And I suppose both of us in the process of transition back then, looking at seeing where God has taken us to. For us, it was moving up to Hamilton to plant a church. And I suppose for you guys, it was becoming or transforming into the Render Gathering. And for me, I think I have so many people say, why go out and plant a church? I remember when I was probably about 10 years ago now, in 2011, we'd just come home from 5 years in Australia after helping a church plant over there. And I said to my wife, I was like, we would never do this again. We'll never be stupid enough to go out to a church plant. And I fully believe that. You spoke about, what caused us to do what we were called to do. And I fully was on par. I was like, we're not going to be doing this, not church planting at least. Always felt the call to ministry. My parents, my dad, he's got a master's in theology. He wanted to be a teaching pastor, and in our movement we were in, that wasn't sort of allowed. You had to be first a reverend or lead your own church for 5 years before you could become a senior pastor. And my grandfather before him, both grandparents on both sides were pastors as well. And so you can say it was almost filtered through down the lineage, a call to ministry. And for me, that sort of clicked when I got into my own relationship with Jesus at about 19. Even growing up in a Christian home, it didn't quite all fit until I was 19. And so, it's been a lot. I suppose the basis of it all was just the fact that I just want to be able to add value into people's lives wherever we go.
Nice.
And the greatest value of that is the value of Jesus, opening their eyes to see Jesus.
Yeah. And that obviously, I think, and just a couple of things to touch on that you've mentioned and that we might circle back to is, I think innately any young leader or person, might not be young, but coming into leadership, pastoring a church, taking up some mantle like that, is innately excited about the the opportunities and the way, and use the word adding value. And I think that's so true. Like, we just really want to add value. And if I circle back to some of that stuff, like right at the beginning, because you mentioned that we met in the lobby of this conference, and I think that's where we do align some of our stories. I mean, we both come from these sort of backgrounds and upbringings around church and God, and my father, some similarities there with your whānau, your family. And it led us to this convergence point where, very similarly, like you, it's interesting as you say it, you were like, never again, we will never do that, we will never plant. And yet you find yourself in this lobby talking to this other brown face, saying, hey, we're looking at each other, we're both planning, or some form or shape of reestablishing, re-engineering, planting church. And we both had said in our own walks of life, like, nah, never me, or never us, or never again. But yet there's that innate optimism and that desire to want to add value. Going back to that, what was it that tipped you over the edge? Because you said you were at a place of nah to now a place of, yeah, we're meeting in a lobby, and I'm pretty sure it would have been at some conference where we're both trying to get juiced up to to find some gold to help us keep going on this thing that we're doubting within ourselves. Like, what was that moment for yourself and your wife that tipped you over the edge to be like, I never want to again, to, I think this is something that I need to do or need to be a part of or feel called to at the moment? And I know you said it was about adding value, but why in this way? Why in this format? Why from this platform? Why from this role, this title, this position?
Yeah, so I think for us, like, our goal was never to be sort of lead pastors. In fact, like, I love just being in the shadows, sort of being felt but not seen, like what can I do to impact something without people necessarily knowing that, oh yeah, that's because Emile and Danielle. So like, I think for both of us, that was who we were. We were much more suited just in the way that we wanted to function as being the people behind the scenes. And there's probably a lesson in that, in the sense that we were just so faithful with being behind the scenes. Like, we were never there to sort of get my own media, like, emilehoods.com, book me now for all your speaking tours. It was never about that. It was always just about how we could move forward the goal of our church, which was to reach people. And we had a sign above our desk for years, probably for the last 10 years, is keep the main thing the main thing. Because so often, we get distracted. We start out with this thing, and I suppose coming back to the question, sorry, I just derailed myself.
It's good. It's good.
But coming back to the question, in 2015 we had a speaker come through, and Joel Cave, great preacher, But back then in 2015, I think their church was only a couple of years old, and he was speaking on the importance of planting churches. Now, up until that moment, like I said, we were happy to be 2IC, and our pastors asked us to think about taking over our home church one day, which was even like, for me, I was like, I don't really feel like that's going to happen. And I remember Joel Cave talking about planting these churches, and I was like, man, this is amazing. Let's do that. Let's get some resources together. I was like, let's start a bank account. Let's start sowing into that for these people who are going to go out and plant a church, because we know how crazy that is. Living their lives literally on the front line of faith. And we're like, I was just so excited by it. And our movement leader said, hey, look, we want to plant 5 churches. And I was pumped. I was like, how can we do this financially? How are we going to resource these guys to go out and plant a church? And I think I'm a bit of a vision junkie in that sense, is that where I see something that can impact a whole lot of people, man, I'll buy into that,
Right.
Like, I want to be an early adopter. I'm that first wave of guys riding the crest, like, because I have the sense, like, call me like an eternal optimist, but I have the sense that if we can do it, God can breathe on it and things can change. And so that's the mindset that I was in. Not that I was going to go and plant, but that I want to do anything possible to help support those who would go out and plant. And it's funny because on this last day, he was speaking at our conference, and this last day of the conference, this last morning, he spoke about um, uh, uh, Elijah and Elisha, how
Mm.
Elijah comes down from the mountain after having this, encounter with God, sort of questioning everything, comes down from the mountain and he puts his cloak, the mantle, onto Elisha, and Elisha burns his plan B, which was his ox, his
Yeah.
his 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 thing. And I felt the Holy Spirit sort of speak to me at the time I was working, and I thought, oh God, you're speaking to me about putting it all on the line to go into full time. Okay, I'll go there. I'll take the hit. We'll go into staff. My wife was already on church staff, and I was like, maybe that's what God speaks to me about. And the moment I went down to the altar call, respond to the altar call, I just felt the Holy Spirit say, you're going to be leaving.
Yeah.
And I sort of felt these ties that were sort of, I always had in my mind that until I get released from where I'm currently at, I will not move to a new place.
Yeah.
And that's where I sort of felt this release in that tie, and it was incredibly emotional. It wasn't like writing on the wall, you have to go and plant this church, but I just felt like it was time to go and step out, and
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
No, that's cool. And so from there, you get this vision, and it leads you to, we're going to launch church, and we're going to plant this church. And you already mentioned it was in Hamilton,
yeah,
and you decide that it's going to be Brave Church. You guys land at Brave. What was that experience like going through? And I think this is a really important conversation here to have now, like to break down some of the perceptions that, it's either easy to launch and plant a church, or it's not easy, or it's very, very hard. Or, I mean, what was that whole experience like? And from the whole plethora of like exhilarating to challenges, like if we could just land that question there, what would you
yeah.
say? What would you speak to?
I mean, like you say, it's exhilarating. It's like finding that new love or whatever. It's like this thing that just captures your attention, and all your imagination just goes into like how this thing will be amazing.
Mm.
But I suppose the drawbacks are coming when the practicalities of that come to pass. So we stepped out with this dream, and almost like how Sonny and Cher, we know our love won't pay the rent. uh, and it's like, I know this vision won't pay the rent, but I got you, like, and you just throw yourself all in. And then I suppose that's where the disappointments start to just land a little bit. At first, disappointments, they become like just a little annoyance,
Right.
like the first disappointment, it's just like a little annoyance, and you're like, oh, I wish that didn't happen. And then the longer goes on for, I think those disappointments start to build like its own sort of momentum. Like just some of the things that happened was obviously finances, but that's where we trusted God. But probably the biggest thing was that people question motive. Who are these guys and what are they doing here? And that's probably something that I didn't think about at all. My interactions with other pastors in the city and how they would question who I was, because for me, I'm just like, oh, well, it's just Emile and Danielle. We're just here to add value.
Yeah, right.
And so therefore, if you're in the city, man, you'll be stoked to have us. We're on the same
Right.
team. We're here to add value. But I suppose for some people, not knowing us sort of as people, like I mean, they knew the brand that we put out there. They knew some of the stuff that we were doing. They knew that the look that we were after. But because they didn't know us as people, and I suppose have a true sense of our motivation, that caused a whole lot of conflict, because people assumed that we were trying to steal people from them, or trying to squash. There's like a hostile takeover. If these guys get big enough, they're just gonna suck everything into them, like a black hole. Where essentially, I think that was probably a misconception, and it just added into further isolation, if I was honest. When you have those interactions, that they can either lead to two different outcomes. They can lead to you guys getting together and becoming closer, overcoming the interaction and using it as a basis to grow intimacy, or it can become one building block that helps separate you even a little bit more. And then as you do put more blocks in place, the further and further separated you are.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably some of the looking back. That was probably some of the areas where we could have invested a whole lot more time into.
Right.
We were really big on investing into fixing up systems, investing into fixing marketing, into even look and branding. That I suppose that's where we feel comfortable in.
Mm.
And because we've always been around people who sort of know and understand us, we didn't take out that time to I suppose, create those opportunities for other people to know and understand us.
Sure. And I think it's as I say this, it's a simple assumption to make that, hey, we're all part of the family of God, and therefore we're all part of the same goal. And you shouldn't be threatened by me coming along to try and move that shift that needle and move that goal that we're all supposed to be aligned with. That is the assumption, right? That we're going to do that, but then the very real, the realities and maybe even the humanness of it all, whether it's our own egos, misconception, lack of going through a process, all of those sort of things happen, and we begin to find out, oh, like this is not quite what we thought or expected. And I think even that point there that you mentioned, it's interesting that, and because I have this conversation with a lot of people all the time, in the midst of trying to propel something forward or trying to stand something up or trying to move the needle, we tend to go to the things that we are either gifted or skilled at, or the things that we can tangibly affect. Such as, I mean, you made mention of things there like, we're good at marketing, branding. Like we could touch all of that and get that sorted, but it was this other part which is called people and relationship, and even if you get that right, like I think it's really important to say maybe that even if you did all that well, there's no guarantee, right? And my fear in saying that, there's no guarantee that people would have put their arm around you and said, "Hi there, Mai, come on in." Or do you think that's a fair comment, or do you think that's got no
No,
truth to it?
absolutely. And to be honest, there were a few pastors that welcomed us in. In fact, the pastor whose church we were closest to, probably only about 800 meters or so away from, he was the one that welcomed us with the biggest arms. Like, in fact, like he made opportunities for us to hang out, and not from from totally different movement and everything. And he was the one that sort of built a bridge of understanding, which is really incredible. But it also came from the fact that he was a church planter too,
Right.
and so he'd known the struggles that you go through, I suppose, setting up something. And like, to be honest, probably 40 years ago, the atmosphere would have been very different in starting a church. I wasn't here 40 years ago, only just, but I would imagine that back then it was a lot more easy to trust motives. Where in today's sort of postmodern thinking environment, we tend not to. We tend to be distrustful of authority anyway.
Right.
And when someone comes in saying, "Hey, I'm the new thing in town," you're just like, "Well, you better earn your stripes." And buddy, like I worked my, and I suppose it's a little bit of human nature, and we're here obviously to live out of our spirit nature. But I think just with everything, we all have that struggle where where it's easier to defend your rights than to sort of be consistently listening and walking where God's leading. I mean, I love to say as a pastor that I'm consistently listening and walking into where God's leading, but we all get it wrong because it's so easy to slightly just sort of move off track and look after my selfish interests a little bit more just to protect myself, and maybe it's that, maybe self-protection and
self-preservation,
probably, and I maybe this just as an aside, but I know you've grown up in a Christian home, in a pastoral home, and I've seen the way pastors are treated, and you see the stuff that happens behind closed doors and boards and stuff. And I mean, we on those places now, but and the way people were treated kind of makes sense that some people try and look after themselves now and build protections around them to not get treated that way.
Yeah.
Because in the past, I think the church, like, and I'm not talking about a movement or anything, but the church as in general, well, the churches that I was part of didn't actually look after the leadership well enough. And it's almost like the leaders have to hold on for everything that they need, or
Yeah.
with everything they have, in order to live a sustainable life into the future. And I think we probably weren't even going to go there, but I think
Mm.
ultimately that's probably a pain to the heart of God, is that we just don't know how to look after our leaders in a way that can help them transition
Sure.
healthily, so that the church can keep on its generational focus. But that's
Yeah.
probably a discussion for another
No,
day.
no, that's good, man. I
It's
think, I mean, this is the whole point, was to have this conversation, to see and to ask some of these big questions about what's really on top and what really helps. And I think from your perspective and your experience, um, because even so, from that, going back to and linking it to something I was thinking about, is we live in such an age where you can look on YouTube and Facebook or social media and get a cookie cutter idea of what your church and your pastor should behave like he should preach like TD Jakes, or he should look like who's that other guy, help me out here,
Furtick, Furtick.
Verdict, and sound like this, and not only it's happening for the congregation, but the pastors themselves are under this immense identity crisis and pressure to be like, well, success and meaning and value and church value and being an effective church looks somewhat like that. We model it, and we're so saturated with it that now you go back to this whole conversation about care and support for what a pastor's focus and role is. That can get totally missed, and it can get totally made something other than what it was supposed to have been. And I mean, even just to quickly jump on that, like you mentioned it, and I think at the start of this conversation, we talked about both of our upbringings. And for myself, when I asked you that, and you made the comment around, oh, never us, we're never going to be part of a church plant again, we will never lead one. For me, part of that statement was, I'm never going to be a pastor, was because of some of the ways that I had seen my family experience life and church and God. And I love God and I love his church, but I'm like, man, if they're going to treat us like that and my dad like that, or I'm going to see that and you don't see it and you see how much time he puts in, like all of those very real human things are the reasons that we land at this place, to the very point that you're talking about, which is how do we, or we must, better care for pastors, not just now, but for the generations. And you're absolutely right. So with that being said, like, and then I'm going to come back to just for you guys, Junior, real quick. What do you think we as the church, as a priesthood of believers, can do to help care better for our leaders? Not just pastors, because leadership looks different in a whole lot of different forms. But
yeah. Well, I think it's probably, if we're being really honest, and this, I know even for me as a youngster growing up, or like when I say young, like in my 20s, is the sense that I think we probably don't put enough value on our leaders. Like in brown cultures, we're really good at honoring them with doing stuff, so like we're really good at and I respect ways. And again, I'm just talking from my context where I grew up. And I'm African. I grew up in my brown neighborhood. I went to a brown church. We then I only hung out with my first white friend when I was 19. So that's the first white person I spoke to. So like it was very, very sort of, you just grow up in that. And so when I say growing up brown, like that's what I'm meaning. I know New Zealand's a lot more multifaceted and multicultural like that, but like for me, what I noticed was that we're really good at sort of honoring them in a respectful, always sort to address them as pastor and sort of bow your head when they came to the room and take your hat off when you're speaking to them. Sorry, bro, I'm not disrespecting you, but so we're treated how to honor them by that, but I don't think we've actually placed a big value on what they carried, or and how we allowed them to lead us. And especially, I know this is one of your things that you're amazing at, but especially in those discipleship conversations, because
Mm,
that's where the real honoring comes in. Is that if we really honored them, we'd allow their words to have weight, and then allow their leadership to affect our walk.
mm,
And ultimately, if we valued that, then we would realize the value that we'd place on them and protection that we'd put around them as a family, because of the great value that that is into our lives. And
yeah.
so, um, and that even comes down to salary. Like I heard one person say of a fairly big church, this person said, "Oh yeah, but I only earn this much an hour. Why should the pastor earn more than me?" And
Mm,
this person was a like just working a trade job, and as a sort of an apprentice. So really early in their growing career, like uh,
yeah.
apprentice, just learning the ropes. And this was a pastor who'd been in pastoral ministry for 25 years plus, and
Yeah.
and sort of hit me, because if that's how we think, like, hey, their work isn't as valuable as my work, therefore their what we pay them should be less. Then the same like you, I saw, like, when my dad was a pastor
Mm,
on church, like he worked there all week, and he got paid so little that our family couldn't even afford to keep a roof over our heads. Like our mum
yeah.
was the breadwinner,
Yeah.
you know,
Mm,
and for me, I was like, I don't want that. Like,
yeah. Yeah.
break your back for people that,
Mm,
put all of this in, and again, it's not about the money. It's not at all about the money. But
no.
when you look at, like, for kids growing up, when they look at how all of this whole value is placed on the person,
Mm,
then it's to say, actually, do I want to sacrifice all of this, uh, for this to be the outcome, for this to be the impact
sure.
that I leave on people's lives,
Yeah, that's
so.
right. And I
Mm,
think that's some great thoughts, Emile. And I mean, I think it's might be wrong. John MacArthur had a really interesting perspective on, he was asked, I think it was him, he was asked the question, how much should a pastor be paid? The eternal question. And his response was, well, if he's called to serve you and you want him to serve you well, like, pay him and enable him to serve you well. And that means he's not going to have to hustle for his family, and he's not going to have to hustle on the side, to try and serve you. Like, look after them to enable them to serve you well. And while that doesn't come with a dollar value, I think it speaks to some of the things you're talking about here that, we need to understand. I think maybe have a rethink about what is valuable in society right now. I mean, society's moving into the space where the great new buzzword theme, and every organization is now getting a wellness officer. And, we're thinking about wellness, and it's so important. But, man, we're thinking about, like, pastors have been providing wellness support for so long. And there was I can't remember what series it was. It was on Netflix. And I thought, this is so true about pastors, and you might like this. There was a quote that goes, and I think talks about nursing in general. It says, you save one life, you're called a hero. Save 100 lives, you're called a nurse, right? And I thought about that, and I was like, man, that's not too dissimilar to, like, pastor work. Like, affect one life, you might be called a hero, but affect many, I reckon you're called a pastor, right? You're
yeah.
called to minister, and we could go on and on about what it actually means to be a pastor without going to Bible college or in other forms. It's called seminary or whatever that might be. But being that. So appreciate your thoughts on that, bro. I want to just jump. You were talking about just some of that disappointment stuff as you
Yeah.
and dealing with that in terms of being a church plant, and even if you're not a church planter, like trying to start an enterprise or a business or leading people, like, we all deal with disappointment, right? And you see, there are some things that just disappoint you when it comes. Like, how did you and your wife and your leadership team, but more so yourself, how did you deal with, and how do you still continue to try and figure out dealing with disappointment? Just maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think one of my strengths is that I'm an optimist. Like, I'm very future focused, and but that can give me some real blind spots when it comes to disappointment. So
Mm,
because I'm so optimistic, when disappointment comes, I just shrug it off without what you said. How do you deal with it? Like, I don't deal with it. I just shrug it off.
Mm.
And so what tends to happen is that down the track, like in months part as months go by, those things still haven't been dealt with. They've just sort of been left in the wake, and they slowly start sort of nibbling at your
Mm.
attentions. And because I'm optimistic, I just tell myself, "Don't worry, it's going to work out," without really dealing with it, you know.
Yeah.
And probably, I think, you know, COVID was just a crazy time. But one of the things that COVID did, and I think we spoke about this personally, me and you,
Mm.
but it accelerated a lot of what was going to happen. It didn't necessarily redirect what was going to happen. It just accelerated it. So
Yep.
what might have taken 10 years was now done in 3 months, you know? And possibly today, even 18 months later, we can look back and say, for sure, that's exactly what's happening, even in the world today.
Mm.
But but with that COVID acceleration, what it did was all these disappointments that were sort of held back, and especially as it relates to things that don't just change with time. Like, we sometimes sell ourselves a myth that says, "Oh, it's going to get better with time,"
Yep.
you know, fake it till you make it type of deal.
Yep.
But when it doesn't get dealt with, it all just sits there as baggage. And when the right time hits, or like when the right occasion hits, when your guard's down, or when you're tired enough, or
Yep.
when things don't work out just that one more time as you hope, all of those things just come rushing back. And that's what I felt. And what really helped me through that time, or even today, as we're going through today, was just the help of a counselor. You know, you speak of the need to speak to, or, you know, saving one life. And I
Yeah.
think of these counselors, and, you know, I was like, man, if we opened a counseling consultancy, we'd rake it in. Like, which again, you know, I'm grateful for them, grateful for the work they do. But
That's the
again, my
optimist in
business
you.
mind, yeah, my business mind's just like, hey, let's set up
Yeah.
our own wellness, you know.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, man. And
yeah,
I mean, even on that, and we're going to get to in a moment, and I appreciate again your time, Emile.
yeah,
You know, I'm hoping to get to just sort of some of the recency of your guys' own story, but just even thinking about some of that disappointment and having to come through it. Like, no one is exempt. If you have a heart and you care about things in life, and you're human and you bleed, like, you face moments where it didn't work out or it didn't go as you thought. And even to all the, whether you go to the trainings and you go to the experts, and I find, like, even, you know, even if you look on social media at the moment, they're like, grow your influence, do this course and you grow your influences by 10,000 in 2 days. And, like, people do that stuff, or they apply these 5 things to shift your business, and they do it and they don't get the results, or they do everything that they were trained to do and it still doesn't quite happen as it was sold on the box. That just amplifies these feelings of, you know, doubt and uh, disappointment and all of that sort of stuff. So with that being said, like, shifting into, because now I go back to, maybe might have been 24 months ago, or maybe a little bit shorter than that. As we do as pastors, we were planning our preaching rosters and schedules, and you'd said to me, "Hey man, like, would you come out and talk to our leadership team and whatnot?" And I said, "Yeah," and we booked it in a long time ago, and then it wasn't too long, or some time had elapsed, and as you did, you gave me a call to sort of follow me up and make sure that I was still locked in and we were about to go. But you then shared with me some news of a shift that happened for you guys. And yeah, and I'm going to ask it in a way that you can share as little or as much as you want. And it's not so much about the event that happened or the moment, but I think what has to go on in your head and in your heart to, and all the things that you have to consider, why and how we got there, what decisions we had to make and why we made those decisions. And I mean, again, as little as or as much as you want to say, so you guys had, just for the listeners, some context, they had planted this church and it was now a couple of years in, and Emile and Dania and the leadership team have, I think it was post first COVID, made some decisions and looked at the lay of the land and came to a place. Yeah. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. So for us, I suppose, when we set out to plant this church in 2016, we had this vision for a generational church. Like we really felt God had spoken to us, and
Mm.
I suppose we wouldn't even have done it without God being speaking to us and prophetic words and the advice of the people that we surround ourselves with too, sort of men and women of faith. And yeah, we started 2017, and I suppose at the end of 2020,
Mm.
sort of looking back, I realized just with what was happening, I was weighing up a whole lot of things. Our family life situation has changed. Our family got bigger,
Mm.
and that brought with it. For those of you who know our family, you follow us on social media, you know what I'm talking about. But that brought with it a few, uh, a lot of added complexities. And for us, this was just supposed to be a short-term thing, but in the end, it became a long-term thing. And as we looked
Mm.
at it long term, weighing up all the changes in our family, the changes that we were going through as a society, I suppose the increased mental challenges that what were brought along with COVID, just the weight that that carried for uncertainty around work and all of those things, housing, and then as well as leading a church. And one of the things about being a church planter sometimes is that it's great because you're so flexible. You don't have a space, you don't have a mortgage, you're flexible to do stuff. But sometimes in times where there's a lot of shaking, you
Yeah.
need something rigid, and lots of times people look to hold on to something rigid. And I'm not saying this is why like people left, but there was a sense where we only had a few left of what we started with,
Right.
and we had to make the decision. Like I had to ask myself, do we as a leadership team, do we shut this down and restart it? And
Right.
so we started thinking that way, like, okay, how would that take? How much work would that take? Because they say it's easier to start something, it's easier to give birth than to
Yeah.
resurrect the dead. And so
Yeah.
we were thinking, okay, well, how do we repackage this and make it in a way that's sort of fresh and new? And we had those conversations, and I suppose it came to about February, and I just found myself, and I told my counselor this. I just found myself sitting at the front of church, like before anyone was there, waiting to welcome people in, and I was
Mm.
just sitting there with no expectation or hope that things would get better. And that was a dangerous place to catch yourself in. And I'm so
Mm.
glad that we were able to have those conversations before anything else happened, because I tell you what, the despair in that situation, and I don't want to say it's a lack of faith, but there definitely is a faithlessness in that
Right.
place
Right.
where you feel like, God, I know you can do all things with the touch of your fingers, but
Yeah.
right now I feel like nothing can get me out of this space,
Mm.
you know. And ultimately, that was where I found myself in. And to be honest, the rest of our team, they were grinding, they were still amping away. My wife too, and that's where I suppose I had to reconcile what's going on with me as the leader, and
Yeah.
and bring some people, some professionals into the room, which is great. And the counseling conversation, I remember after the first counseling session, the counselor asked, Emile, are you more interested in what other people think of you, or you are more interested in the well-being of you and your family?
Mm.
And that was a real question of pause, because it allowed me to look at the motivations that were pushing me at that point. Like, what were the motivations pushing me at this point? It was no
Mm.
longer about adding value. It was more of looking not like I failed at what I set out to do.
Yeah.
It kind of takes me back to probably one of my favorite stories, like Genesis 12 verse 7, or Genesis 12. Abraham's taking the step of faith where he's going from his hometown of Haran, beautiful place by what all the scholars say about it, just
Mm.
great place to grow food and stuff, like
Yeah.
beautiful. And he's walking towards this promise of God, and he gets there, and when he gets there, God even unfolds greater promises to him. God gives him these greater promises, And then in the next verse, after God gives him all these wonderful things, every nation on earth is going to be blessed through you.
Mm,
Everyone who blesses you will be blessed. Everyone who curses you will be cursed, and your name will be known. You'll be made famous throughout this area. And the very next line in verse 7, it says, "And then a famine struck the land."
yeah,
You know,
yeah, yeah,
and it's amazing how in the midst of being where God's called you to be, in the midst of being in that place, challenges will come to the point where, like even like Abraham, the father of faith, questions what he's doing in that place. Either I stay and lose everything that I have,
mm,
or I have to find another way through. And I don't know which part of that, you know what I mean? Like for me looking in, I was like, Abram, that was so faithless,
yeah,
you know? And I can see it, but I don't think he lost faith in God. I think the situation just came to a place where he had to make a hard call.
yeah,
And when you're making a hard call, you never know what the right answer is for that call.
yeah,
And the truth is, just like Abraham, we were confronted with just a stark reality.
yeah,
If we keep going down this path, and I keep myself in this place, it's probably not going to end well for those closest to me who love
yeah,
me. You
right.
know, do I believe that God's strong enough that even when I fail, that His will won't?
Yeah,
You
absolutely,
know,
man. Yeah, that's good. And look, so many thoughts going through my head about a lot of the stuff you've said there. And just to give another side of sort of my experience of that, even for you guys. So when I received that call and you told me before I came out to see your leadership team, and I remember you telling me, and I felt like it was a gut punch too, because I'm like, yeah, man, we're the brown faces of the church planting movement, and we're brothers, and I felt it for you because I know what the shoes are like, and I know the hearts that are behind what you're wanting to see, and that value you talk about wanting to add. Like I know that, and I know that heart that you have to do that, and I've heard you preach, and you're gifted at it, and 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 we know that that's not the only place and space to do it, but to know what's gone in, right? And I think that's that sinking feeling, like that's the gut punch part, to know how much it's been invested in, and then to think, well, and I was sitting there selfishly thinking, all right, so because I thought what was coming was, hey, so yeah, bro, look, don't come, and we're not having it now, and you were like, so man, we're still meeting, we'd love you to come and sit with our leadership team and speak to us, and I was like, far out, what do I say? Like, what is it that I could possibly say? But God really spoke to me in that moment and said, man, just go in and be and hang. But the second part, very similar to the story you talk about there in Genesis, was, I think I shared it at the time about, we are much like this, where Christ comes into ministry and he's called into it in that moment in the waters. He's baptized and the heavens open and God says, this is my son for whom I am well pleased. And you're like, yes, Lord, my ministry's starting. I'm chosen. You've prophesied on me. And then directly after that, it says he was led into the wilderness to be tempted. And we have those wilderness moments. And that was
yeah,
something that really continues to stand out for me. But I was listening to another podcast recently, and it was Louis Giglio, I think, and he was talking about how in that moment of, this is my son for whom I'm well pleased, and he talks about for us as leaders and pastors even, because he was talking about from his own hard time, and this resonated with me, and it might resonate with you, is that when you understand where you're coming from, you have more security and less worry about what you're going for. And he talked about that moment, like, and it was revolutionary, right? Like Christ gets spoken to from God and says, here's my son for whom, which I am well pleased. And that was before he'd done any miracles. He had spoken any big sermons. God was pleased with him because he was willing and he was ready and he was
so
received,
good.
versus having done anything yet, right? And I think we try and find our purpose in, Lord, I will do all of this for you, then I will be great. But God's saying you've already got greatness on you before you go. You don't need to justify it by doing things, by being things, by standing things up. And so I'm going to say for you, my brother, from my own perspective, as I've been going through this journey over the last sort of 2 years, what does the Render Gathering look like as we move forward and grow into our calling What, where do I sit in all of that? Like, does the render gathering happen without me? It needs to. And then even in that, and I was talking to a counselor, and it wasn't initially for my own, but it sort of became like that, right? We ended up talking, and he said, we're talking about the business of everything, and he said to me this. He said, "Cliff, I want to ask you something. If you," he goes, like, you do so much stuff and you make so much difference, and it's all good stuff, but he said, "Is there a whole lot of stuff in your life that you're doing that you just feel like, and it deflates you?" And I said, "Yeah, man." And he goes, "Can you tell me what that?" And I told him, right?
Yeah.
I told him what that was, and he was like, "Why are you doing it? Like, why are you doing it? God didn't put you here to walk around deflated and to feel like, oh, I've got to do that, and it sucks the life out of me." He said, because, which we sort of innately know this, but coming back to that point, which is actually, where do I add the most value? And if I'm doing a whole lot of things that aren't adding value to the ones I love the most, like, man, I need a reality check. I need to step back. I need to step out. So I want to say to you, Emile, and to you, Dania, and to your leadership team, like, for that moment and for this moment, to have the candidness and the courage to not just say we had to make a decision, because I always believe, and I still stand on this, that leadership isn't about a right or wrong decision. It's about making them.
Yeah.
Good, bad, or otherwise, right? You're a leader because you believe you want to help make decisions. And sometimes it's just not right or wrong. There is no clear answer, but you've got to make one for the people that you lead, and you've got to make one for yourself, and you have to move things and steer things forward. So you have to make a decision, and it's hard. And I think that's okay to acknowledge that. And I want to thank you for being that voice today to say, you know what? God set us on this path, and then circumstances changed. And I had to, and you're sharing very candidly that you're speaking with a counselor like that, man, that's important leadership conversation to be having. Like, we keep telling young leaders or projecting on young leaders that to lead, you got to have it together. To lead, you don't talk to anyone. To lead, it's got to be all right. And you can't show flaw, weakness, development, or growth. You just have to be on. Like, man, that is growth. That is insight. That is humility. And I think as we learn from that, as we look at that, in Mel, I think in a lot of ways, there'd be so many that would be like, man, I wish I was in that moment. Like, I wish I could have the courage to have that conversation and to talk like that. So, I mean, as we sort of try and steer this towards some sort of conclusion, I've got a couple of big questions I do want to ask. I think they're important. So where are you? So you made that decision. You say, as a church, we're going to, and maybe I'm using the wrong term, but we're going to push pause on Brave.
Yep.
We're going to push pause, and we're going to what? Is it going to sit in the wrestle of this, or go and hear more from God, or go and work out this life stuff at the moment and then revisit that?
I think it's a combination of all of that, bro, to be honest. But for me, like, if you know the type of person I am, I call myself the hustler. Like, I like to think that I'm the guy that makes things happen, like, I'm not real extroverted in terms of my actions in a crowd, but if no one is around taking the lead, I'm that guy. Like, I'm going to step up, like, and for me, I'm more at home being the one that's initiating than being the one that's sitting back.
Sure.
And I suppose even before we even put a hold on church, I sat with my counselor and I worked out what this would look like, because I suppose the temptation would be to drop something and then start something else. And I'm sure, like, you could imagine when it became public that we're sort of pressing pause with Brave, I had a flood of offers come in,
Right.
and people that we have a relationship with, and people that love us and say, hey, come over here, or hey, I've always wanted you to be on staff here, and like a flood of offers. And what I'm grateful for is that in that time, before we made the decision public, when we knew what was going to happen, we could sort of come up with a plan. And it wasn't like a week by week plan, but it was sort of, hey, So because we were going to be moving cities, hey, let's give us 3 months to find a place that we can just attend church, you know?
Mm.
So within 3 months of getting there, let's put a thing on this because we don't just want to get there. Because, in busyness of moving, you can just say, or well, truth is, in transition, there's a whole lot of stuff that need to be done, and
Yeah.
you can just keep on doing the stuff that need to be done. But we just wanted to say, hey, actually, we value we value being part of a community.
Yeah.
Let's make sure we set a date for when we expect that to happen, you
Yeah.
know? And then the bigger thing, we said, hey, for 12 months, we're just gonna sit and allow the Lord
Right.
to speak to us,
Yeah.
sit and not just sit passively, but while that's happening, have conversations with counselors, make our worlds bigger by bringing people into the conversation, you know, deal with some of the stuff that we've always wanted to deal with, but never had the chance to. um,
Mm.
have fun as a family,
Yeah.
build some new rhythms, and figure out what that looks like. Where are our boundaries now? Like, what's a good boundary to help us move forward while uh, encouraging our children to put their lives on the line for Jesus. So what
Mm.
are some boundaries that allow all of that to happen? And that's kind of currently where we are in the minute of, like, where's a safe place? Because again, like, not all places where you sit is necessarily safe.
Yeah.
And for us, we have
Yeah.
to look at even just who knows us in the church world. Moving back to our hometown, we've got a long track record, but because we have that track record, it comes with an expectation.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
finding a place where there's no need for that expectation, so
Yeah.
that was a hard part. But because it's so important, because otherwise you
Mm.
just get sucked in without taking the time to really find healing from
Yeah.
those areas that have been highlighted.
Yeah. No, that's great, man. And I love what you said there. I think it's so important to highlight that you didn't just drop like, oh no, we're not feeling this buzz anymore, and it's time for a change, or I'm feeling despondent, it's time for a change. It was actually measured, and even that pause was thought through. It was, and I think that shows great leadership insight to say we're not just going to do this on a whim. We're going to transition and communicate our way through, because just because we're not gathering as brave in that location, it doesn't mean that those relationship threads are lost and aren't needing to be cared for. Like, there are, but just not just yourselves, but all those people that are still connected to it. So I
Yeah.
think I'm trying to say to anyone that listens to this and takes something from it, like that moment of clarity to say we're going to plan the pause is so important, right? It's not just a moment or a whim, because we're in a society now, we talk, whether it's cancel culture or unsubscribing, just stuff gets quit like that, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not leading that. I was leading that. I'm not leading it anymore. I don't feel like it. But I just want to highlight that. I think that's really important that you mentioned that, bro. So on a real future forward focused looking perspective. Now, I'm not going to ask like, oh, so what are you doing in 12 months? But I am going to ask this: is what have been the real advantages and you've spoken to some of it, so it's a sort of a two-part question. What have been the real advantages of taking the moment to breathe and not rush back into just the grind or being busy again or the hustle? What have been the advantages for that for your family? Because this is not just helping other families and other part leaders' families. Like, I'm listening to you too and thinking, yeah, these are real rhythms that we all got to understand for families. So what's been the real advantage of that pause and that shift and that refocus on God? And how has this then shaped your intimacy with God in a different way, if I could put
Yeah.
it that way?
Yeah. So I'll start with the family first. One of the things about moving back to sort of our family location is that we've really put a big emphasis on what our role is in leading not just our immediate family but our extended family as well. And by leading, I mean like leading to Jesus, not a hey, we here, we're going to tell you what the rules are, but more
Mm.
like, hey, we've experienced this. There's members of the family that aren't experiencing this. How
Yeah.
do we bring clarity. I think for me, the first time I had that moment was probably in the mid 2000s when I realized that I was doing all these things for church, and there's nothing wrong. Like I love serving the church,
Yeah.
but even as a young 20-year-old, I was doing all these things for church, like youth. I was at church 4 nights or 5 nights out of 7. And I
Mm.
used to love that, but in that we miss ministering to those even living in the same household, you know.
Yeah.
And even
That's
though I
good.
was present at church, I was absent from the family, from with my parents and my sister.
Mm.
And I suppose you learn that, and then you forget about it because your life goes into different rhythm.
Yeah.
And now being back in this, we've just sort of making that space. Actually, you know, our lives exist. We are called to this thing not as individuals. We are called as the collective to be the body of Christ, and that collective doesn't isn't just the people in my church. It's the people in my family as
Mm.
well. It's my neighbors, you know.
Yeah.
And for my family, man, that should really be the place where now in this time where we don't minister on a stage, or where we don't have to set up a church and we don't have to put speakers and all those things up. Hey, we
Yeah.
can speak into the lives of those people, you know,
So
and not
good.
just speak, not just speak, but I love what you said when you came to hang out with us that time, just to be in the room.
Mm.
And
Mm.
now we just be in the room and not come up like I don't because I don't have past the label. I don't have to come up with a solution.
Yeah.
And what I found is that that actually allows people to be more real because
Right.
they know you're not going to try and tell them what to do, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And by doing that, they actually become more open. Uh,
No, that's
and
awesome,
yeah,
man. So
in
good.
terms of my own intimacy with God, I think it's really been a challenge if I'm being real honest.
Yep.
Um, and the reason is because for so long I knew what it was to prep a message. I knew what it was to read for a purpose, to spend
Mm.
time with God so that I could see a result, to be in God's presence because I was believing for a breakthrough or needing to get somewhere. And now, when you remove all of that, I realize just how anemic my intimacy was without any of those stuff,
Yeah.
without me needing God to answer this latest drama. What does that relationship look like? What does my prayer life now
Yeah.
look like? What do I say, God? Like, oh,
Yeah.
um,
And I feel you on that, man. I think so many leaders, pastors, tend to get into a rhythm of the only time we're really picking up our Bible is to prepare a message for those that we need to feed, you know, where we're not thinking about our own feeding and just, if we talk about presence or time, like just sit with him and be and hear and listen. So I think, yeah, bro, that's powerful and it's important. And I just want to encourage you, man, keep pressing into that challenge. Like that's the
yeah,
challenge we all have, right? Is to ask ourselves, where am I at with God? Not where am I at with my church organization or my ministry role or my leadership. Like
yeah.
if it was as me and him sit down, how often does that happen? And then what's the depth of that conversation? And I think the richness of life and ministry and call gets solidified in those moments where you hear him. And that's what, one thing I want to add is I think part of my confusion early on in my years is, and even to today with the amount of saturation of information, we talk about ministers and preachers online and all sorts of stuff you have to compare yourself to, or you can easily compare yourself to, is in all of it, how do I hear his voice?
So
How do
good.
I how do I cut through the noise to say, Lord, is this you? Is this your voice, or is this the voice of my ego, or is this the voice of my pride? Is this the voice of my platform calling me? Is this the voice of my followers? Is this the voice of my social media that needs my attention? Or is this the voice of the God that loves me even before I was anything and that birthed me and purposed me? Like that's the voice we should be trying to hear. And that's what, as you've said that, it reminds me of those things as well. So bro, like as we've come to the sort of coming to the end of this time, is there anything else, man, that you want to add or say, or you don't have to, but I mean, if there are any other thoughts going through your head, you just feel like, you know what, I really want to say this. So if anyone's listening and hears this in time, like, I want them to
Oh
take
man,
this.
I think I'll probably all this stuff going through my brain now. I'd love to do like we'd have to do a session two, bro. So like maybe in a few weeks or something, do a session
Yeah,
two because like what I
sure.
really want to get into, and it's something that you do incredibly well. And I've seen you do this. I was actually speaking to my brother-in-law about it just a couple of days ago. Well, without
Mm,
even thinking about the school, I was just talking about you. I was like, "Have you met Cliff?" Because this is what he does really well, and it's the sense of establishing sons and I don't know how to frame it, but the ability to have someone that people look up to as a father figure, but then also that father figure treats as sons who have an inheritance, you know?
right.
And I see you do this across your organization. I see you do this across every level that you find yourself in, like church. I see you do it even the stuff I see on sports chaplaincy,
Mm,
the render gathering media, how you are able to not just be the leader, but to also call people up into this role where they take on the, the responsibility as people who will inherit it
mm.
and then pass it down. And I suppose that's essentially what discipleship is, right? Create a space
Yeah,
where people feel like you were so invested into their lives. And so, yeah, I think that's probably one of the areas that we're probably lacking in most in church, if we're being honest.
yeah.
Uh, in
Oh
businesses,
man,
you pay a lot of money to set those systems up, but in churches, you probably just don't.
yeah. I think it's just expected, and we don't probably do it well. And I mean, it's funny you say that because I've spent the last 3 to 4 weeks just retooling, reshaping, refining, sharpening the pencil on even what our systems and structure, and essentially to say candidly here, like, um, you know, these guys need to put me out of a job, man, and transition to a space where I'm not, um, I'm less and less hands on, and we need people for that. We need to develop people, mentor, disciple, like you said. So yeah, bro, look, I'm keen to pick up this conversation again and maybe get into some of just some thoughts around reflections around approaches and systems and tools, because I know you, and this will be a conversation for maybe a few weeks from now, but you've been through so many different types of training and observations and systems and structures that you would know and have some insight now into, into that too, like what does work and what works in different contexts. And that'll be a really cool conversation to be able to have and just talk more about um, some sort of the practicalities of what it means to lead and to do things as well. So with that being said, bro, look, man, I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your honesty. I also want to say that I totally appreciate how, while we talk about it candidly here, um, how hard it is to go through that as well. And that's not taken lightly, to pour yourself into something and then to have the courage and the, I suppose, resilience to say, no, this is the call for now, for the time, and to see where God's taking you on there. And then to wrestle with where am I at with God and continuing that journey. That truly is being well. It's not covering the questions, it's asking them. It's listening to Him and ourselves and others, and then knowing what is, having some clarity about that. So, Emile, I just want to thank you, my friend. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for your honesty.
Thanks, bro. Appreciate it, man. Always a pleasure for you, bro.